Sherlock Holmes is arguably one of the most famous literary protagonists to this very date and the archetype for anything regarding fictional crime and detective stories. In his own eccentric way, the Victorian detective is an exotic and mysterious character, a man who seems just as smart and brilliant as he is unpredictable and, to a certain degree, dangerous. But nevertheless, at the end of the day, Sherlock Holmes often remains as the incarnation of intelligence and justice for many, since he is the one to solve the most horrible crimes, thus bringing back order and peace. First and foremost, Sherlock Holmes seems to fall in the category of the domestic hero, who serves as a protector. But the great detective is not without his own demons. He occasionally violates the codes of social conduct, consumes morphine and cocaine, is generally a man of eccentricity, and can often appear rather cold-hearted. There's something monstrous about Sherlock Holmes himself, an inherently unsettling nature that carries over into every new adventure and is, at times, even called out by Watson himself. The detective is not the most relatable of protagonists, and that is specifically what Doyle wants to achieve in his depiction of a brilliant, yet flawed and unusual person. Holmes is smarter than the reader, valuing his mind over anything else. He does not agree with the general ideas of the social sphere and thus considers himself not to be a part of it, and has no relationships, platonic, romantic or otherwise, except for maybe his partnership with Watson. Therein lies the fascination with a man like Sherlock Holmes, because our culture instinctively finds the excessive abilities and personality traits of a man like Holmes suspicious, and therefore we are drawn to the mystery that is not only a criminal investigation, but one surrounding the essence of the detective's personality. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle has created a character that has captivated readers for many years, since despite Holmes' unusual bearings as a person, he still remains lovable because he is such a gawky, brilliant eccentric. With a canon of 60 narratives, Doyle offers us a big variety of instances to look into when it comes to a closer characterization of the great detective. Most of those stories are narrated by Dr. Watson himself. He is Holmes' best and only friend and becomes his chronicle shortly after their first meeting in 1881 during the adventure of A Study in Scarlet. Given Watson's writing resume, even though it is disregarded by Holmes multiple times, it is more than safe to assume that he knows the detective best and we can take the doctor's descriptions of his friend at face value. From the very first story, we are led to believe that Sherlock Holmes is no ordinary Victorian gentleman. Watson is surprised by both his range and lack of knowledge regarding topics of trivial and more specific nature. The manner in which Holmes explains his deductions and proceeds to analyze the most gruesome of crimes often appears very detached and even cold to both Watson and the reader. Watson observes that Holmes does not seem to think much about the social sphere, and more often than not we are shown that a detective values his work over anything else. In fact, he is devoted to his consulting to such an intimate degree that Watson cannot help himself but often see Holmes as a machine, cold and calculating. The reader is introduced to Holmes' machine-like nature very early on in the canon. With previous hints to it in the first adventure, it is directly addressed in the second ever story, The Sign of 4, where Watson straight up tells Holmes, "You really are an automaton, a calculating machine," I cried. "There's something positively inhuman in you at times." We're also treated to another description, interestingly enough in A Scandal in Bohemia, a story bearing immense significance, as we will see later, in which Watson, in a preface to the proper story, explicitly mentions, "He was, I take it, the most perfect reasoning and observing machine the world has seen." This almost unnatural side of Holmes is what lies at the heart of the detective whenever he comes into contact with anything regarding emotions, especially love. As can probably be expected, given the early canon examples depicted above, Sherlock Holmes is not a man who tends to dwell on feelings of any kind. If there's one thing he prioritizes above anything, it is his mind and its ability to reason. There's no need for him to hide his opinions on those kinds of matters, even in moments when they are least expected by Watson. In The Sign of 4, we encounter Mary Morstan, who, as we learn towards the end of the novel, becomes the future Mrs. Watson, an event that Watson is clearly very happy and excited about to tell Holmes of. Holmes, however, flat out says that he is unable to congratulate Watson, a reply that clearly upsets the Doctor. And here we are treated for the first of multiple times to Sherlock Holmes' perception of the nature of love and reason. Love is an emotional thing, and whatever emotion is opposed to true, cold reason which I place above all things. I should never marry myself, lest I bias my judgment. There seems to be an almost complete disregard of any softer feelings, and this position even leads to Holmes' sometimes questionable behavior. A good example of this can be found in The Adventure of Charles Augustus Milverton, in which Holmes fights a notorious blackmailer. In order to gain access to Milverton's home, Holmes begins a romance with one of the women working in the house, and even goes so far as to become engaged to her. However, it soon becomes clear that Holmes holds no feelings whatsoever for the woman, and reacts with indifference when Watson disapproves of the blatant use of the woman's affections. This should not really come as a surprise to the good doctor though. Knowing his friend well, he often acknowledges that he does not see Holmes as a romantic person, since, as a lover, he would have put himself in a false position. And thus Watson comes to understand that Holmes does not put himself in relationships of a more emotional nature. His attitude also does not change over the years. In The Adventure of the Lion's Mane, set in 1907, Holmes has retired on his own since women have seldom been an attraction to me, for my brain has always governed my heart. Regardless of Holmes' sometimes heartless nature, for Watson and many of the readers, the question often still remains whether or not there really has never been any romantic interest for Holmes, ever. Watson, as a classic married Victorian gentleman, is, despite his understanding of his friend, continuously surprised by Holmes' apparent lack of loving emotions. While a detective is, of course, not completely devoid of feelings, he often goes out of his way to not only explain his mind-over-love attitude, but also explicitly mentions his disinterest for the idea of marriage and romantic relationships in general. "I have never loved," he tells Watson, and it does not come off as something unusual or changeable to him. When matters concerning relationships to a woman come to mind, Holmes is quick to put them off on Watson's expertise, telling him, "The fairer sex is your department." All of this is perfectly in line with Holmes' unemotional nature. His aversion to women and his disinclination to form new friendships all seem to support Holmes' lack of interest in any intimate relationships. In modern terms, Sherlock Holmes would most likely be asexual and aromantic, someone who simply bears no desire for being sexually and romantically interested in someone. By his own words, Holmes is not a marrying man, and he stays as such for the remainder of his life because, as far as the reader knows, even at the age of 60, in the last chronological story, His Last Bow, set in 1914, Holmes still continues his bachelor life. Despite Holmes' obvious disinterest in romantic affairs, it ought to be noted that he still understands the nature behind such relationships. Even though he gives Watson a discouraging reply upon the doctor's wedding news, he also says that Mary Morstan is "one of the most charming young ladies I have ever met." In fact, more than once Holmes remarks upon the beauty of women, and he is also fully aware of the romantic or sexual interests other people feel for each other. For example, when faced with a case of stalking, he quickly understands that it is part of the settled order of nature that such a girl should have followers. So while it is important to point out Holmes' asexual and aromantic nature, one should not forget that the detective is very much capable of understanding such feelings in order to progress the investigation of his cases. So Arthur Conan Doyle's stories are of a great variety, and at the bottom of every single one of them is a classic detective mystery that needs solving. Romance or matters of love do not make up a big part of those adventures, because they are simply not needed or not important to the characters. Even Watson's own relationship is quickly dealt with in the second ever book, and does not become the focus of that story. Relationships only ever become of any importance if they are in any way significant to the solution of the puzzle put before Holmes. Doyle simply never intended Sherlock Holmes to be a figure of romance, and this leaves open a wide space for interpretation many adaptations have utilized for themselves over the years. In less than half of Doyle's stories, Holmes' client is a woman, which seems to show a clear lack of female presence in Doyle's works. While women do still feature throughout the stories, they usually are part of the very crime that is being investigated, or they are otherwise informants in the mystery. In some cases, the women also become suspects, but the perpetrators in Doyle's stories tend to be of the male persuasion most of the time. The women Holmes and Watson encounter are never really any different from the other mere clients or witnesses. While Watson, as the narrator, tends to remark on a woman's beauty when describing her, he does not approach them in a changed manner, and neither does Holmes. In fact, it often seems more indifferent to Holmes than Watson, the latter one may be letting himself be pushed to a softer way of thinking when it comes to women. Considering that, it seems to make sense that the only proper romantic interest we ever encounter in the canon is Mary Morstan, who becomes Watson's wife. Other than her, and perhaps Watson's second wife, we are basically never led to believe there to be another major love interest for either Watson or Holmes. Some fans and scholars of the canon might disagree, as we will see, since there are in fact one or two women who deserve some special attention. When talking about Sherlock Holmes in relation to anything regarding sexuality or romance, there's one story, and one character in particular, that are hard to avoid. A Scandal in Bohemia is arguably one of the most famous and popular stories within the canon, a success that can mostly be attributed to the character of Irene Adler, also known as the Woman. I already made another video essay that gives you an in-depth analysis regarding the relationship between Sherlock Holmes and Irene Adler, so I will give you the abridged version here. A Scandal in Bohemia has become known as one of the few stories in which Sherlock Holmes is unsuccessful, and even more so it has gained popularity for the character of Irene Adler, the only woman to ever outwit Holmes. It is obvious why readers were and still are fascinated by Irene Adler, since she's arguably one of the most detailed female characters in the entire canon and was able to defeat the Great Detective. As the only woman to ever outsmart Holmes, she has quickly become the most significant woman in Holmes' life for many people. Especially those fans who have created so many adaptations of Doyle's stories over the years often find something special in the story of A Scandal in Bohemia. The problem is that in many of those adaptations, heteronormativity tends to create a romantic relationship between Holmes and Adler, where there actually isn't one. See the Guy Ritchie films as a popular example. The rather unremarkable nature of the Holmes-Adler relationship becomes quite evident as soon as you read A Scandal in Bohemia for yourself. Irene Adler never reappears in any of the other canonical stories, and there's barely any mention of her either. The opening of A Scandal in Bohemia is quite clear about the kind of partnership Holmes and Adler have shared, or rather, not shared. To Sherlock Holmes, she's always the woman. I've seldom heard him mention her under any other name. In his eyes, she eclipses and predominates the whole of her sex. It was not that he felt any emotion akin to love for Irene Adler. All emotions, and that one in particular, were abhorrent to his cold, precise, but admirably balanced mind. He was, I take it, the most perfect reasoning and observing machine that the world has seen, but as a lover he would have placed himself in a false position. He never spoke of softer passions, save with a jibe and a sneer. There were admirable things for the observer, excellent for drawing the veil from men's motives and actions, but for the trained reasoner to admit such intrusions into his own delicate and finely adjusted temperament was to introduce a distracting factor, which might throw a doubt upon all his mental results. Grit in a sensitive instrument, or a crack in one of his own higher power lenses, would not be more disturbing than a strong emotion in nature such as his. And yet there was but one woman to him, and that woman was the late Irene Adler, of dubious and questionable memory. In this opening, Watson reminds the reader of Holmes' disinterest in romantic relationships, and that, while clearly bearing some sort of admiration for Adler, Holmes has not taken any greater interest in her. However, it has to be said that Irene Adler does play a significant role for Holmes regarding the man's perception of women. The Sherlock Holmes of the original canon did have sexist leanings, thinking of women as secretive and distrusting people, notions that also come up in A Scandal in Bohemia. It is a defeat through Irene Adler that changes Holmes' views for the better. So while there definitely are not any feelings of romantic nature between Sherlock Holmes and Irene Adler, she did leave quite the impression on the detective's life. While Irene Adler is one of the most famous women of the Sherlock Holmes canon, and rightly so, there is however one specific client from another story who has not been mentioned yet, and would certainly be the closest candidate when it comes to potential romantic partners for the famous detective. The Adventure of the Copper Beeches introduces the character of Violet Hunter, who consults Holmes on a job offer, which seems dodgy to her. While Irene Adler is not acknowledged as a possible romantic partner for Holmes in the original canon, but likes to be adapted differently by many, the character of Violet Hunter is actually the only woman that is openly acknowledged by Watson to be of romantic interest to Holmes. Violet Hunter impresses with her wit, determination, and a natural sense of observation, all traits which Holmes obviously values. As she tells her story to the detective, Watson notices that Holmes was favourably impressed by the manner and speech of his new client. Violet Hunter is a woman confident in her own skills and means as a person, so she decides to take the job and goes on to notice and even investigate the strange events she comes to encounter. However, she's also defined in her relationship to Holmes and needs the detective in order to solve the mystery and find a satisfying answer to her questions. She relies on Holmes, and the detective even openly acknowledges his fondness for the woman when he asks her to join them in their investigation with the words, "I would not ask it of you if I did not think you a quite exceptional woman." However, just as Irene Adler, and many other characters of the canon, Violet Hunter quickly vanishes from the detective's mind after the events of Copper Beeches. Watson, with a sense of regret, notes, "As to Miss Violet Hunter, my friend Holmes, rather to my disappointment, manifested no further interest in her when once she had ceased to be the centre of one of his problems." Violet Hunter is one serious potential love interest for Holmes to ever be properly acknowledged in the original canon, and yet many people seem to have forgotten about her now. At the heart of almost every single Sherlock Holmes story lies the friendship between the detective and Dr. John Watson. There are only very few things which remain constant throughout Doyle's works, and the friendship between those two men is the most important and consistent one. They both are each other's only proper friend, and are never shy to proclaim their deep bond to the people coming to them for help. Wherever Holmes goes, Watson follows, and vice versa. Holmes and Watson's friendship is perhaps the most famous partnership in literature. Many adaptations have explored the text and subtext of their bond, some of them including a more intimate and even sexual interpretation of it. Even though Holmes is evidently of more aromantic nature and Watson gets engaged to a woman in the second ever published story, A Sign of Fall, it is nevertheless worth taking a closer look at the historical context swinging along with the men's adventures in Victorian England. A bond such as Holmes and Watson share would not have been frowned upon in 19th century society. In fact, the notions of romantic friendships were an ideal that enjoy a high, although sometimes ambivalent, cultural status in that era. In a time that prioritized the desires and needs of men over any other gender's wishes, the relationships formed between two men might indeed even be seen as more emotionally rewarding than the expected marriage to a woman. So it might not be too surprising if one assumed a more intimate level to a friendship similar to that of Holmes and Watson, given how much time they spent together at any given moment, and that it was not too uncommon at the time that society tacitly accepted situations that were full of potential for sex between men, as long as these were not alluded to in public discussion. While the marriage to a woman was taken for granted for a Victorian man, it seems almost ironic that wives were mostly excluded from the men's social sphere, thus furthering a society in which men were virtually left among themselves in anything taking place outside of the family's home. The Victorian ideal of those close friendships was one of self-sacrifice and inspiration, notions that we see admirably displayed in the partnership of Holmes and Watson. The Doctor is the perfect example for the exclusion of one's marriage in order to be with another man, and even though he sometimes wonders whether or not he should leave his wife alone for so long, his fulfillment always falls in line with accompanying Holmes on his investigations. Both men are channeling their desire for being in each other's company through their work together, thus being able to find a sense of closure with the sublimation of dangerous male desire into productive work and initiation into a male community. Watson is very much the embodiment of many of the classical ideals of Victorian masculinity. Men had to be married and were expected to be able to maintain their wives and families and operate in the realm of work and politics. And Watson achieves most of those things in the first couple of stories. A Sign of Fall sees him finding a wife, and in the next published story, A Scandal Bohemia, he is a full-time working physician. His adventures with Holmes, which might be seen as Watson's secondary occupation, do rarely stand in the way of the Doctor's domestic life. In fact, it is that unproblematic freedom of movement from home to the workplace and all male associations that highlight Watson's fully established status within Victorian masculinity. Now Holmes, as one might expect, does not fully fit into masculine stereotypes of the 19th century. Actually, it is the very premise of the first story, two single men moving in together, that makes the detective stand out. Young bachelors were seen as people who did not fulfill social and cultural expectation of masculinity in the period, and with Holmes being 27 at the time of his study in Scarlet, he very much subscribes to that notion of a young single man in Victorian London. In fact, he remains a bachelor for the entirety of his life, preferring the solitude of a cottage in Sussex over whatever 19th century conventions would have forced upon him. Staying unmarried was frowned upon in those times. Long-time bachelors were not only seen as problematic, but outright considered not to be proper adult men. Holmes's aversion to the ideas of romance, marriage and family would make him an outsider in Victorian patriarchy. But despite the occasional exclamations of wonder coming from Watson, the detective is never truly seen as a complete outsider within his own social circles. Those slight deviations from Victorian conventions only highlight Holmes' unusual personality, making him even more of a fascinating character who readers would want to know more about. Holmes and Watson's friendship is the very definition of care, respect, and trust. While Holmes clearly is the smarter one of the two and at occasion likes to mock Watson, the great detective is not blind to the Doctor's presence and their conversations. Watson already tells the reader in the very first story, A Study in Scarlet, that Holmes very much stimulated my curiosity, but it is also Holmes himself who utters a similar sentiment in The Hound of the Baskervilles, when he explains that Some people without possessing genius have a remarkable power of stimulating. I confess, my dear fellow, that I am very much in your debt. They both feel not only comfortable, but also inspired in each other's company. While many adaptations tend to emphasize the Doctor's lesser mental capacities, it has to be noted that Holmes is fully aware of Watson's capabilities when he acknowledges that Watson has some remarkable characteristics of his own, to which, in his modesty, he has given small attention. Watson manages to succeed Holmes' boundaries in regards to relationships within the first couple of days the two men know each other, as can be seen in A Study in Scarlet. Watson goes along with Holmes' strange habits without knowing of the man's true occupation, and even during an after investigation into murder, Watson never doubts him and remains his companion for many adventures to come. Work is everything to Sherlock Holmes. He lives for it, and usually does not welcome any sort of interference. But when Watson slips into the detective's life, Holmes quickly comes to trust and include him into his cases to a point where it is either both or none. You may say before this gentleman anything which you may say to me. Sherlock Holmes' in a way need for Dr. Watson's friendship becomes evident early on and endures into the detective's older age. Upon Watson's news that he will wed Mary Morstan, Holmes is unable to congratulate him, and in subsequent stories there sometimes tends to be a sense of betrayal or abandonment whenever Holmes finds himself alone or addresses Watson's marriage. In The Blanched Soldier, Holmes, as the narrator of the story, describes that Watson has deserted me for a wife, the only selfish action which I can recall in our association. I was alone. As the story goes on, it becomes clear once again how inspiring Watson's company could be for Holmes, who even admits, "I miss my Watson." By cunning questions and ejaculations of wonder, he could elevate any art into prodigy. The Dying Detective is a very good example for Watson's devotion and strength of companionship. Sherlock Holmes, without the Doctor's knowledge, pretends to be seriously ill, quickly causing Watson to visit him at Baker Street. In Watson's eyes, Holmes' behaviour has become very irritating, but even when it angers the Doctor, he immediately wonders, how could I be angry when I saw him lying in such a plight? Which once again proves that Watson's care for Holmes always comes first. The detective goes on to give the Doctor rather odd instructions, and the reader is treated to a wonderful display of Watson's high opinion of his friend. I have so deep a respect for the extraordinary qualities of Holmes that I have always deferred to his wishes, even when I least understood them. The conversation eventually culminates in Holmes' instruction to go fetch a certain doctor who should take a look at him. Of course, Watson is surprised when Holmes seems to disregard him as a man of medicine and trust. However, it has to be noted that even then, during an instance that clearly hurts Watson, Doctor does not protest and instead puts his friend's wish first, as he says, "If you have no confidence in me, I would not intrude my services." Naturally, Holmes later tells him that he had no fun in putting Watson down and did not intend to harm him. He admits not telling Watson about his plan because of the Doctor's immense compassion for his friend, which could have endangered the investigation. It is not because Holmes does not deem Watson capable enough, it is because he is aware that the feelings they bear for each other are too deep to be easily contained. The Dying Detective is a perfect example for the men's mutual respect and Watson's never-fading faith when it comes to Sherlock Holmes. While Watson takes on an impossible-to-destroy loyalty, Sherlock Holmes also assumes an unusual depth of emotion that is unique to their friendship. As explained earlier, Holmes does not wear his heart on his sleeve and tends to disregard all forms of close relationships. However, Dr. Watson becomes the only person Holmes allows himself to either be emotional in front of or directly and openly care about. One of the most obvious instances that come to mind is, of course, when we learn about Holmes' apparent death in The Final Problem, and the detective's final words are meant only for Watson because he wants him to be safe and unconcerned. My dear Watson, I write these few lines to the courtesy of Mr. Moriarty, who awaits my convenience for the final discussion of those questions which lie between us. He has been given me a sketch of the methods by which he avoided the English police and kept himself informed of our movements. This certainly confirmed the very high opinion which I had formed of his abilities. I am pleased to think that I shall be able to free society from any further effects of his presence, though I fear that it is at a cost which will give pain to my friends, and especially, my dear Watson, to you. I have already explained to you, however, that my career had in any case reached its crisis, and that no possible conclusion to it could be more congenial to me than this. Indeed, if I may make a full confession to you, I was quite convinced that the letters from Meiringen was a hoax, and I allowed you to depart on that errand on the persuasion some development of this sort would follow. Tell Inspector Patterson that the papers which he needs to convict the gang are in Pigeonhole M, done up in a blue envelope and is inscribed Moriarty. I made every disposition of my property before leaving England and handed it to my brother Mycroft. Pray give my greetings to Mrs. Watson, and believe me to be, my dear fellow, Very sincerely yours, Sherlock Holmes. When the detective occasionally openly admits how much Watson's loyalty means to him, the doctor notices the rarity of such a situation. For a moment I saw something in his eyes which was nearer to tenderness than I had ever seen. Watson is aware of the uniqueness that comes with Holmes openly showing his affections, and he sees how much love lies behind the detective's emotionless facade in a rare but beautiful instance in the story of The Three Garrett. Nearing the conclusion of the case, Holmes and Watson are attacked, and the following scene occurs. In an instant he had whisked out a revolver from his breast and had fired 2 shots. I felt a sudden hot sear as if a red-hot iron had been pressed to my thigh. There was a crash as Holmes's pistol came down on the man's head. I had a vision of him sprawling on the floor, with blood running down his face, while Holmes rummaged him for weapons. Then my friend's wiry arms were around me, and he was leading me to a chair. "You're not hurt, Watson. For God's sake, say that you're not hurt." It was worth a wound. It was worth many wounds, to know the depth of loyalty and love which lay behind that cold mask. The clear, hard eyes were dimmed for a moment, and the firm lips were shaking. For the one and only time I caught a glimpse of a great heart as well as of a great brain. All of my years of humble but single-minded service culminated in that moment of our relation. "It's nothing, Holmes. It's a mere scratch." He had ripped up my trousers with his pocket-knife. "You're right," he cried with an immense sigh of relief. "It's quite superficial." His face set like flint as he glared at our prisoner, who was sitting up with a dazed face. "By the Lord, it is well for you. If you had killed Watson, you would not have got out of his room alive. Now, sir, what have you to say for yourself?" There's nothing more important to the stories of the great detective than the friendship he shares with the good doctor. Watson is arguably one of the most loyal and trustworthy companions in literature, always staying at Holmes' side even in the most dangerous situations. Sherlock Holmes is known as a cold machine. We rarely see him act out of some sentimental value. Nevertheless, in his friendship with Watson, we see Holmes' emotional character, since the Doctor is the one who humanizes him. Until the very end of Holmes' career, it is Watson, his best and only friend, who he chooses to keep in his life so they can continue to adventure together. Now, before we wrap this whole thing up, let me just say that this is only my personal interpretation of the Sherlock Holmes character. As someone who is asexual himself, I always find it quite exciting and comforting to believe that my favorite fictional character of all time is just the same as me. However, that's not to say that Sherlock can't be straight, gay, bi, queer, or whatever to you. If you think Sherlock Holmes is gay and he and Watson love each other, that's great, and I don't want to tell you otherwise. Everyone should be able to form their own opinions on such matters, regardless of what the original creator or some random guy on the internet tells you. As Roland Barthes said, the author is dead, in Sherlock Holmes' case figuratively and literally. So there's nothing stopping you from coming up with your own interpretations regarding any kind of cultural product. I simply made this essay because I love everything that has to do with Sherlock Holmes, and examining sexuality and gender in fiction has always interested me. The ace community doesn't get a whole lot of representation, and when it does, it isn't always great. And perhaps there are some people like me who find comfort in knowing that one of the most famous literary characters ever shares the same identity as them. In the end, we all enjoy the stories about our favorite detective, and that's all that matters.